Thank you, Michael, for scene setting. So today we're going to talk about sort of the context in which these airports will be developed, will be installed, and that's against London's growth. London is growing regardless of the airports. London is growing. Why are we interested? Well, Transport for London would be interested in any airport proposals because normally we'd be assessing the impacts of airport proposals on our networks. So from a surface access point of view, we're interested, but the Mayor's more broadly interested because he's interested in London's growth and how aviation can support that. So what is London's growth? Well, we were all saying sort of in 2010 when we published the Mayor's Transport Strategy that London would grow to about 9 million. Well, we all know it's going to grow, well, we all thought it was going to grow to 10 million. The ONS figures last week said it's 10.3. And if it does grow to 10, there'll be extra 5 million trips on our network each day. That's the level of impact on our network. So from some 27 million trips per day to an extra 5 million trips on top of that. But London isn't going to just stop growing come 2030. And when we're looking at aviation, we're looking beyond 2030. The sort of central forecast for growth up to 2050 is 11.3 million people, and that'd be as many 10 million more trips on the network. So when we're thinking about the provision of new airports, we have to think of them against that background of growth. So we're building things to support growth, and we need to do that. In terms of where the growth is going to occur in London, the sort of the darker the red areas, these are by boroughs of London, the higher the level of growth. And as you can see, quite a lot of the growth is skewed to the east, particularly sort of like inner East London. So a lot of additional growth across London. And we've got lots of schemes planned in order to accommodate that general growth. Everyone knows about Crossrail, Thameslink, all the tube upgrades that we've got planned. And other schemes that are sort of on the books in terms of Great Western Main Line electrification, a whole load of Network Rail schemes that Paul will sort of say that they've actually got commitments to, High Speed 2, and there are improvements that are planned already for the major roads. These are schemes for which we have the money and will be being built and provided. But are they enough? Well, we know they're not enough. We know that actually all of these things are actually playing catch-up with trying to deal with the growth that will occur. If we look at the, say, underground crowding at present in London, well, not present, 2011 figures, anything that's black on this network is very crowded. This is 4 people per square metre sort of standing on a crowded part of the network. So as you can see, in 2011, the underground was very much crowded on large sections of the underground, particularly in inner London, but also sort of on the Piccadilly line going out to Heathrow and on the southern lines going out towards Gatwick. Come 2031, despite all the investment that we're committed to with all those upgrades, we see improvements as we go forward to the 2020s when these improvements come online, but then the growth continues to add to the pressure on the networks, and we start seeing a deterioration in those networks again. So come 2031, with all those committed schemes, we'll still see a lot of black all over the network, particularly even on Crossrail routes going out to the west. Certainly a lot of sort of like black on the sort of like routes going out to the south as well. So we are literally playing catch up with our growth with the planned improvements that we have. And similar situation on the highway agencies' road network. Red on here means sort of like severe delays, implying that the M4, the M25, the M23 will all be sort of like severely delayed. And with the growth that's forecast across the network, these things will get worse. We also know from our own work that we did on the Roads Task Force, the roads aren't just for people to move along. It's not just about sort of like allowing vehicles to sort of travel along as fast as possible. We've got sort of ambitions and responsibilities to improve the quality of life, to actually improve the environment, to make London a nicer place in which to live. So whilst we're trying to keep things moving, we're also having to sort of provide some more space for people to cycle, for people to sort of walk, for people to actually sort of be able to get across some of the major roads that we have to reduce severance. So there's a lot of objectives that we have to put in place that in fact take some of the capacity that we currently have out of the network. So we've got to sort of weigh up the pros and cons of how we deal with that going forward, i.e. it's not all roses going forward without talking about the aviation debate. And some people think, well, actually, with the aviation demand, it's all about filling in the sort of like less used time in the off-peak. You've just shown me peak figures, but actually in the off-peak there's some spare. But if we look at what's happening in the aviation world, and these figures just for Heathrow, you can see from the blue line that many passengers are actually arrive first thing in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning that they're arriving. and they will actually then load onto the networks, crowded networks, during the morning peak. The actual red line is passengers departing from Heathrow, and they depart throughout the day. So they will have arrived at the airport at different times of the day. And then if you look at the yellow line, which is actually the sort of boardings on the Piccadilly line from airport passengers, it sort of has little peaks of its own, with a PM peak that coincides with a normal peak. So it's not just about airport demand filling in off-peak periods, it's about airport demand also coincide with some of the peak demands that we've got. So what do we do about it? Similarly, as I say, for the road network as well. Well, our estimates for the impact of, say, the Inner Thames Estuary, which is assuming a 4-runway estuary in the east, or Gatwick additional runway, or a Heathrow additional runway, is that sort of Gatwick could place an additional 6,800 trips on the public transport networks in the AM peak, and some 5,500 extra road trips in the AM peak. Heathrow could place some 9,200 trips on the PT networks and some 7,500 road trips on those networks. But can those networks absorb them? Well, against this background of growth, we would argue you have to see what else is required to absorb that growth, not to assume that the schemes that we've got committed can be assumed to accommodate that growth. What we've done is we've tried to sort of assess what's required for each of the proposals that's on the table. So Heathrow, 1 runway, Gatwick, 1 runway, Inner Thames Estuary, sort of 4 runways, and what's the sort of minimum level of surface access provision to these alternative locations, and what's the optimal level of surface access provision. And to compare them with the sort of our understanding of what's been put in each of the documents to date by each of the promoters. So, and compare them also with the objectives that the Airports Commission have said in terms of what surface access should provide, in terms of good connectivity, many of the points that Michael's been making, good journey times, maximising the mode share to those airports, comfort and service. When you are usually catching an aeroplane, you might be young and have a thing on your back, a rucksack on your back, but more than likely you've got some bloody great suitcase, so you want a bit more space to sort of use your suitcase as well. And therefore we need to consider the impact of providing for surface access to the airports, and also the broader impact of providing for regeneration and wider development that the provision of surface access can deliver. So this table tries to set out what's the minimum requirement to connect an airport and what's sort of the optimal requirement. What TfL put into the public domain when it submitted its reports last year for sort of Stansted and for the 2 inner Thames and Outer Thames estuary airport options was the optimal provision. So from a TfL point of view, what would you expect to provide for passengers? What would we be expecting? We don't want them all loaded on crowded services, pushing out sort of like commuter trips in their place. So, you know, we were putting forward the optimal provision for the Inner Thames Estuary. But then that was getting compared with the what we would call low provision, which other people had put in their submissions. So what we're saying is you have to compare like with like. So what's the lowest provision for an Inner Thames Estuary airport? And what's the optimal provision for Gatwick and Heathrow versus an Inner Thames Estuary airport? And those are the sort of the comparisons that should be made when the Commission is actually looking at the impact of the different proposals. So we've got 4 levels of provision. Optimal, as I said, which is actually providing people with a good level of service, even in the PM peak, ensuring you've got good connectivity, maximising mode share, and enhancing the experience of the airport, down to low, which is sort of a basic connection onto the existing networks. This particular table gives you a little bit more detail about some of the assumptions that we've made. Now, people might query these, and I'm quite happy to go through individual points. But we've also put in here, people might think, well, say for Heathrow, why don't you just take Western Rail access and Southern Rail access and the Heathrow spurs are given, because people have talked about them. Well, they're not funded as such, and they are associated with Heathrow. So if you're looking at the sort of total package for supporting Heathrow, they should be things that are part of that shopping list. But in terms of what was put into the Airports Commission, we're talking about sort of like a limited provision to ensure that you can sort of connect into the existing networks of some 2.1 billion, of which I think 1.2 billion was assumed to be costs that the taxpayer would pay anyway. And we've done that for Heathrow and Gatwick, as well as the Thames Estuary Airport. And if we look at, say, Foster's submission for the Thames Estuary Airport, we place that in what we call an intermediate level, just above low intermediate level, in terms of the level of provision. But we, TfL, when we come to assess these proposals, so when the decision's made by the Airports Commission, and we want to assess the impact on our network, we want to make sure we're assessing them on an equal basis, sort of right across. They're either looking at them at low, intermediate, high, or optimal. And what you'd want, personally, from our perspective, is at least a high provision across all airports. In terms of what was put forward last year for the Estuary Airport, this is the optimal provision. This is actually providing high-speed links from the airport into central London, ensuring that it's well connected not just to London but to the rest of the nation, if it's going to be the nation's key hub, making sure that there's good road access to the airport as well, ensuring that the M25 is sufficiently widened to cater for increased road demand, because as Michael said, there's people who will want to use taxis, and that's even assuming a high mode share for that particular airport. And if you put that infrastructure provision in, not only are you providing access to the airport, you're also opening up whole areas that are ripe for sort of further regeneration in terms of sort of helping generate more jobs. So an airport in that location with this level of surface access provision could give rise to some sort of like nearly 400,000 additional jobs. But the surface access, if it's only provided at that very low level, which is, say, sort of like referred to before, would not give rise to that level of jobs. So you need to sort of, say, compare like with like when you're doing these analysis. So our main conclusion of the work to date is what are the true and full costs of each of the proposals in terms of accommodating this additional demand. Some of the assumptions, I believe, that have been made to date in some of the bids that have been put forward are that if we are, say, putting Thameslink in and there's going to be an increase in capacity on the Thameslink line, well, that just absorb the additional demand from Gatwick. Well, it's absorbing the growth of London, and the sort of like growth in Gatwick will be additional to that. So if we were doing an assessment from a sort of a TfL point of view, we'd be saying, oi, you know, you're actually placing a greater demand on the network, we'd like to see a greater level of provision. So let's just consider all these things on an equal playing field. And that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Michèle.